Hey everybody, it's Mr. Herzl. I'm the Social Studies Coordinator at Life School, and I'm going to talk to you today about Thomas Jefferson. This might be your first time as an 8th grader hearing this lecture. It might be, your teacher sent you here the first time to kind of look at it. It may be a review that your teacher already presented this material, but they sent you here to kind of review it again. Either way, I'm going to help you understand Jefferson a little bit better. As always, we start out with the TEKS. This is what the state of Texas wants you to know. Thomas Jefferson, 8.5a, describe major domestic problems faced by Thomas Jefferson as he led the new republic. So this is talking about different things that he had here at home. Judicial review, we're going to talk about that and teach you what that is, and a couple other things. All right, so let's get started. Okay, election of 1800 was a turning point in U.S. history. So they call it the Revolution of 1800. It marked the first time in U.S. history when one political party transferred power to another. So you see John Adams here on the left. Let me pull my pointer up. I like to always have that going. Okay, so you see John Adams here on the left, and now he is a Federalist, okay? And Thomas Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. Remember, this is the two parties that have now emerged in the United States. So we have a two-party system now, and we still have it today. So Thomas Jefferson represents that side. John Adams represents the other. John Adams is going to lose, okay? And the Federalists had power. And even though George Washington had said that he was not a part of a party, he was really people consider him a Federalist. And so when John Adams is a proclaimed Federalist and we switch from the Federalist Party in power to the Democratic Republican Party in power, that's a big deal. In a lot of countries, that doesn't happen peacefully. If one party rules, they keep the power. And so this was a big test for America to see if we would transfer power peacefully, and we did do that. Okay, so you see the election here. So John Adams here is in this kind of pinkish color, and he won these states, and then Jefferson won these states. And what you'll see here is that these are kind of agrarian states, even out here kind of in the West, in Pennsylvania, in that area. Those are mainly agrarian states. In his idea, agrarian means that they're farmers. So Jefferson's ideal country would be a bunch of people farming. Now, his ideal it wasn't farmers with slaves, it was self-sufficient farmers, okay? It was farmers who had a little bit of crop that they could grow, feed themselves, and trade with what they created. And so, that's kind of his ideal. Now, something interesting that happened during this election, the person who is running... so here's what happens. Okay, the people vote, then the Electoral College votes, and the Electoral College is going to vote as well on which candidate. They get to vote for two people, a president and a vice president, okay? But theoretically, there's a problem with the Constitution originally. Theoretically, they could vote for that vice president to become president, which is kind of confusing, but whatever. So they long story short, they vote, and Aaron Burr, which is supposed to be like Jefferson's running mate here, he gets as many votes as Jefferson does. So what happens is, when that happens, it goes to the House of Representatives to decide. And so they have to decide, are we going to vote for Aaron Burr to become president, or are we going to vote for Thomas Jefferson to become president? Now, this is very interesting. If you'll remember from last time, the person who really disagreed with Jefferson the most when we had Washington in the presidency was Alexander Hamilton. Remember the big bank debate? And, they basically disagreed on a whole lot of things, okay? They disagreed on, Thomas Jefferson supported the French. Alexander Hamilton supported the British. They had that big squabble about the bank, so there was no kind of love lost between them. They didn't like each other. Well, Alexander Hamilton's a part of the House of Representatives who's going to make this decision. And you would think that he wouldn't vote for Thomas Jefferson. But, interestingly enough, Hamilton really, really didn't like Aaron Burr. And later, Alexander Hamilton is actually shot and killed by Aaron Burr in a duel. And so he did not like Aaron Burr, even back then. And so he convinces a lot of his colleagues to vote for Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson becomes president. All right? And Thomas Jefferson gets on in and he says, we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists. So no matter what you believe, hey, we're all a part of the same country, and we're all in this together. We're all a family. Okay, this is just describing what I just described. Sometimes I get ahead of the notes. So Aaron Burr ran as vice president. They planned to split the Electoral College, but it failed. All right, Hamilton didn't want Burr to become president, so he gathered votes and became and voted for Thomas Jefferson. And then you can see here, this is that duel that we're talking about. So it was common back then that they would, if you got offended by someone, you would challenge them to a duel where you would stand and shoot at each other. And that sounds really crazy, but most of the time what they would do was they would line up against each other and then they would shoot over the heads of each other. So they would say, we gathered, we dueled, but no one got killed, And they would have this agreement beforehand that they would shoot over each other's heads. What happened was Hamilton sent a note to Aaron Burr and said, hey, let's shoot over each other's heads, let's not kill each other, but we need to meet and have this duel, which I know to us sounds stupid, but whatever. Aaron Burr never gets the message from Hamilton, and he shoots him and kills him. So Hamilton raises his pistol and shoots above Aaron Burr, and Burr shoots at Hamilton and fatally wounds him and kills him. All right, so Jefferson's party marked the start of nearly 30 years of dominance by the Democratic-Republican Party. So the Democratic Republicans are going to... So early on, the Federalists are really a powerful force in American government, but they basically go away, okay? They go away. They don't go away, but they're no longer in power. They're not going to have power they're not going to have the majority of power, I should say, ever again. All right, so you see this. The Federalist Party is here. George Washington is considered a Federalist. John Adams, and then you get these Democratic Republicans. And this is interesting. John Quincy Adams, who is the son of John Adams, is actually of the party of Democratic Republicans even then. All right, and then after him, you get Andrew Jackson, which you guys will learn a lot about later on. Well, there he is, Andrew Jackson. And he starts the Democratic Party. Right? If this image captures Jefferson's vision of an ideal America, what was the vision? And again, it's that agrarian lifestyle, agriculture, agrarian, meaning that every family has a little bit of land that they farm. Okay? It's called subsistence farming. I don't know if you necessarily need to know that term, but just a subsistence farming means that you farm enough for you to eat and live and trade. All right, Jefferson wanted to reverse Federalist policies by reducing the size and cost of the national government. Jefferson is an idealist. He looks at the founding documents. He looks at the American Revolution. He says the entire reason we went to war was to make the government smaller, to have the government have less power. And the Federalists had proven that they kind of believed that, but not really. So they did believe it to an extent, but they believed that the federal government should have quite a bit of power, especially those who had money. And their belief was, listen, if someone has money, if they have land, then they're intelligent, and they have a dog in the fight, you might say, having land, and so they have something to lose from making poor decisions, and so they'll vote correctly. Jefferson doesn't believe any of that. He believes that basically all men should be able to vote. And again, at this point in time, we're talking about white males. There are some rules back then that allowed blacks to vote, but that was not those were in northern states, some in Massachusetts, but that was not, by far, that was not the norm back then. All right. He believed the government had grown too large and powerful. All right. He cut the size of the army. He eliminated taxes on whiskey, slaves, and property. He allowed the charter of the Bank of the United States to expire. Big surprise there, right? Like, he argued against that the entire time during Washington's presidency. Of course, he's going to let the Bank of the United States expire. And he focused on paying down the federal government's debt. His idea was, we cannot be a nation in debt. Okay, we cannot have these massive debts. We can't incur these massive debts, because if we as a nation incur debts from other countries, When you owe someone something, they can call in that favor. If you owe someone a favor, they can call you and say, hey, I need this now, right? And basically, you become a slave to that person, or a slave to that country that you owe money to. And Jefferson wanted us to be as independent as possible. So these are all very popular things back then. They're also very popular things right now, to have a smaller government. These are the things that America's founded on, having a small government, not having as much taxes. The people rule the country, not the government ruling the people. All right, an agrarian republic, again, I've used that term a lot of times. But he believed that would protect liberty. And he thought that the way that you protect liberty is if everyone is working on their own with their farms. They own their own farm. They're not in debt to anyone, okay? They also are not dependent on anyone else for a job, right? So this idea of a job was there in the United States, but it wasn't prevalent like it is today. Today, you grow up, you go to college, you get a job, right? Back then, it wasn't necessarily like that. The idea of a job was like, that wasn't really, having a job was for people that were really at lower caste in society, okay? Because that meant that you basically were a wage laborer. And that's not the ideal to him. In other words, if you have a job, you're basically, again, a slave to whoever you're working for. Can you quit? Yeah, sure, but you don't have any money anymore. So if you want to keep your job, you basically have to do whatever that person wants you to do. And for Thomas Jefferson, he said that's not the ideal situation for a free population. An ideal situation is for everyone to own a little bit of land, have their own means of production, and control their own destiny. Right? But the Federalists did not want to see their policies destroyed, so they're gonna fight Jefferson on some of these things. Okay, so President Adams, at the very end of his presidency, used the Judiciary Act of 1801 to appoint a bunch of judges. So he basically says, I'm making all these people judges. And it's at the very end of his presidency, literally on his way out, his last hour that he is in power, he is signing, that he is, the last hours that he's president, he's signing these things to make these guys judges. And the reason why is because he wants to keep power for the Federalists. He doesn't want all his policies to be reversed. And so he wants all these judges who agree with him to be in power. All right, so Jefferson comes in and he says, whoa, this is not right. Like, this guy was signing all these things, and this is even after the election happened. So Adams was still in power, but he knew that the will of the people had elected Jefferson to kind of go in a different direction. And he says, this isn't right. And he orders his Secretary of State, which is at that time is James Madison, to deny some of the judge appointments. And there's a reason why they deny it. Some of the things weren't filled out properly by Adams. And so he wants him to deny that. Okay, so one of these guys is a guy named William Marbury, and Marbury is supposed to be a judge in D.C., and Madison says, nope, you're not going to be a judge. This wasn't done correctly. You can't be the judge. Okay? So this is Marbury versus Madison. It's very important that you understand what Marbury versus Madison is. It's going to be on the STAR test. I almost guarantee it's going to be on the STAR test, and you need to know it. Anytime you think of Marbury versus Madison, you just need to think of Thomas Jefferson denying those judgeships to Adams' people. Adams wants to keep as much power as he can, even if he's not going to be the president. So he basically puts a bunch of people in power as judges that agree with him in the last moments of his presidency. And then Jefferson says, nope, you can't do that. All right, so you can read over this. I'm gonna let this roll for a little bit and just give you a minute to read it, so that this makes a little bit more sense to you. Okay, if you want to, you can pause that and read more of it. I would encourage you to do that so that you understand it, because it's very important. Again, if you'd like to, you can pause this. And again, I would encourage you to do that so that you understand Marbury versus Madison. Okay, so this is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. When things can't be decided, when there's somebody sues somebody else, and it's not like a criminal thing, it's a lawsuit. So like it's not somebody stole something from me, or it's not a criminal case. It's a civil case. Those can work their way all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. And basically, the Supreme Court decides what cases they're going to take and what cases they're not. So obviously, this is an important one, and they take this case. And so they basically decide to deny Marbury his judicial appointment. Okay? So they say that, listen, we're going to deny him the judicial appointment. Okay? And Marbury is saying, listen, Congress created the Judiciary Act to create lower courts with judges. Like, they gave them that power. Jefferson and Madison argue, yeah, but the president can appoint, not deny whoever he wants. Okay? And so there's this big argument about it. The decision that the Supreme Court makes is that, yes, they don't have the power to okay, so they say that his judicial appointment didn't violate anything. So they actually side against Jefferson. I said that wrong earlier. They side against Jefferson. They say, listen, the appointment didn't do anything, okay? It didn't do anything to violate the Judiciary Act of 1789. So it was completely lawful. But we can't do anything to enforce it, okay? And so that kind of doesn't sound very important, but it really, really is important. And the reason why is because they just made a decision for the first time. The Supreme Court made a decision for the first time that something was constitutional. They said, okay, yeah, we don't have the power to enforce it, but that thing that Congress did, completely constitutional. And they had never said that before, okay? And that's a big deal because they just basically made themselves the final authority when it comes to things that are constitutional or not. Okay? Was it constitutional? Was it not constitutional? And that is called judicial review. So if anyone ever asks you what judicial review is, it's the idea that the Supreme Court has the power to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional, and anything else that it wants to that comes before it. Okay? Now, they can't just make a statement, hey, this is unconstitutional. They have to wait for a case to come in front of them, okay? And then they can rule on that case whether it's constitutional or unconstitutional. That wasn't the original intent, or that wasn't the original job of the Supreme Court, but through Madison versus Marbury, it becomes the job of the Supreme Court. All right? And now it's the entire job of the Supreme Court. If you talk about the Supreme Court today, everyone that knows anything about them knows that they decide what is constitutional and what is not constitutional. Okay, John Marshall is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, so he's leading the Supreme Court when this happens. And what's interesting about John Marshall is that he is, it's kind of funny, so he's the Chief Justice, and he really consolidates or makes the power of the Supreme Court more powerful, okay? So he makes these decisions over and over and over again that establish the power of the Supreme Court to decide what is constitutional and what is not. And that is a big deal. If the Supreme Court can decide what's constitutional and what's not, they can really steer what happens in this country. They're almost, I would say, nearly the most powerful branch of government, and they're the leader of that branch of government in the judicial branch, okay? But before that, they weren't. But after Madison versus Marbury and John Marshall and these cases here, eventually they have become the most powerful element in our government, in my opinion. Okay, so John Marshall, again, he's going to use the Supreme Court to strengthen the power of the national government. And he does that multiple times. So John Marshall is you could consider him kind of like a federalist. He's going to over and over again strengthen the federal government. Okay, so there's these different cases. McCulloch versus Maryland. They try to tax a branch of the BUS. McCulloch versus Maryland. It was a Supreme Court case that reaffirmed the national government's power over the states. So anyway, Maryland tries to tax these individuals, and Maryland tries to tax the branch of the United States, or I'm sorry, the Bank of the United States, and the Supreme Court says, no, you can't do that. Okay, so they rule that you can't tax the national government. A state can't do that. We think that's crazy. We think that's funny to even hear. But back then, that hadn't been decided. So again, we're sorting all these things out at the beginning of our nation. Okay, states could not tax federal entities within the states. Okay, so another one is Gibbons versus Ogden. So Ogden had a monopoly on steamboat trade in New York, and New York had affirmed that he could do that. They said that, he could have a steamboat, and they had given him a license to do that. Thomas Gibbons is a steamboat captain. He had bought a license to operate from the federal government. So again, this is state versus federal government. Who has more power? Who has the power to give this guy a operating license, okay, to give these guys? And they sue each other for it, okay? And the Supreme Court, again, John Marshall is going to side with the federal government more than the states. And it's establishing this thing where the federal government slowly has more power and the states are having power taken away from them through the court system. Again, through a federal entity, which is the Supreme Court of the United States. And so the Supreme Court in Gibbons versus Ogden rules that Gibbons could operate along the route because the national government controlled interstate commerce. So he again sides with the federal government. Okay, there's a lot more that has to do with the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, but we're going to cover that in another PowerPoint. So that's all for today. I hope that you guys learned a lot, and we'll see you next time.